Alright, hello everyone. Welcome to my philosophy presentation. I am Damien Page, of course, and I'm giving a presentation for PL101H Honors Introduction to Philosophy. But of course, you probably knew that if you're watching this video. My presentation, and of course my research as a whole, was over war and violence in society, and how war and violence has always existed, how we always are looking for it, and it will never cease to exist. How it is a necessity in today's society. I might have just said that. I forgot. It's fine. So let's dive right in. And warning, it's a philosophy research paper. It's a controversial topic. It's war. It's violence. It's everywhere, and it's scary stuff. So let's get right into it, shall we? So let's take a look ahead, and just so you know what you're in for, and you can stop the video now and pretend like you actually watched all of it. So, first we'll be starting with the introduction, in which I'll provide my thesis and a little bit of further warning for the topic. Then we'll be looking at the philosophical methodology. This is where I really get into where the philosophers I chose, how I chose them, why I chose them, and basically a little bit about the way they thought and the way that I can incorporate their thoughts and their bodies of thoughts into my research. And after that, we'll be looking at the societal view of war and violence. This will include morals and customs and how society has seen war, how war never changes, it's always the same, and of course, how war is a necessity, it's inevitable. And then we'll be looking, of course, at probably my favorite part of this, which was the fascination with death, and how we are somehow drawn to death, and a possible theory as to why we're drawn to death. Spoiler alert, Sigmund Freud is mentioned. I am sorry, I apologize in advance. And then, of course, a conclusion to wrap things up. Typical presentation style, you know how it is. So, of course, with the introduction, I always like to start my research papers with a quote or some kind of hook that gets the reader interested, whether or not the reader is just the instructor or not, whatever. This quote is especially interesting. Okay, I'll just read it for you. Hopefully you can read. You say a good cause justifies any war, but I say a good war justifies any cause. Any guesses as to who might have said that? Well, it's none other than our boy, Friedrich Nietzsche over here, a well-known philosopher for being immoral and for being a nihilist. We'll get into that in a second. It's really interesting how he brings up this quote, because I found this quote as one of the last parts of my research paper. I just inserted it. I wanted something good there to start it off. And spoiler alert, Friedrich Nietzsche is one of my philosophers. So I decided to use a quote from one of my philosophers. And he had a really good quote about war, so I just decided to throw it in there. You say a good cause justifies any war, but I say a good war justifies any cause. It's really interesting when you think about it, how we justify war and we try to find excuses to have war. It almost is like war is a necessity and we're trying to hide it in modern society or something. Food for thought. War has existed as long as civilization has. Okay, if we look back in history, if you take any world history class, there will always be mention of a war. Um, if Egypt fought against the Romans, and the Greeks fought against also the Romans, I'm pretty sure. Had to double check on that one. But we get further into society, you know, we have wars that are extended on for long periods of time. Um, I'm sure you can imagine them. Can't think of an example off the top of my head because I'm drawing a blank, if you will. But of course, then we have more modern wars like World War II, the Vietnam War, the Revolutionary War, which it's not modern, but it's modern in the sense that it occurred within the history of the United States, which really isn't that long in the course of world history. I digress. Human society has always seen war as a necessity, yet the acceptance and favorability has been diminished over time. And my voice cracked, I apologize. Just forget about that. Human society, war is everywhere. War is used for resources, war is used for land, war is used nowadays for money and for fun, but that can also be seen as a resource depending on who you're talking to. But as society has progressed, the acceptance of it, the acceptance that war is something that's okay, that we should be doing, has gone away. We started to see war as a sinful thing that no one should ever be participating in, and we have to vote to Congress to have wars instead of just saying, yeah, let's wage war with them, because war is a bad thing. It's not a good thing anymore. And so that's really just what society's like nowadays. This is the time that we start to get into our philosophical methodology, what the different philosophers were all about, and we're going to start, of course, with our boy. Actually, just kidding. I just remembered. I need to tell you who the other three are first. Let's do that. Okay. But of course, we have our boy, Friedrich Nietzsche, this brilliant, dapper man with the mustache here. Very sad history on this man. He had a mental breakdown in his 40s, and he died 11 years later, and he lived a very sad, painful existence. But I can imagine most nihilists live that way. And then, of course, next we have someone you probably don't know, St. Augustine. He was around a very long time ago. He's a very old person. I don't expect anyone to know who he is. I mean, he has a portrait, for crying out loud, not an actual picture. But he was a Algerian priest, and he was known for his philosophies about Catholicism and how Catholicism affects us, and how we should follow the word and teaching of the gods. Um, but he also had a really interesting theory about war, and we're going to get into that pretty soon, because it's kind of the whole argument with him. Moving on, we have Sun Tzu, excuse me, who was a Chinese tactician and military strategist, and he is very well known for his book, The Art of War, which you might have or may not have heard of. And then finally, we have Michel Foucault, who is a French philosopher known for his studies about power and how the bourgeoisie is in control of everything, kind of similar to Marxism, but also not at the same time. And we won't so much be focusing on his power so much as we will be focusing on his theories about knowledge. So hopefully these four will provide us with some useful information as we move on to our first and arguably the most well-known of the four philosophers, which is... Hello, there we go. Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche's philosophy was all about nihilism and amorality. Nietzsche was considered to be both of these things, a nihilist. Now, some people say that he wasn't a nihilist, but for all intents and purposes, he was a nihilist. But he was especially well known for being amoral. He disregarded society's current morals and really just imparting his own. And very controversial at the time. People weren't really a fan of his theories, and it wasn't until long after he died that we started to decide that, hey, maybe he brought up some good points. The big thing with Nietzsche, however, was his concept of the Übermensch, which means Superman. He wanted every individual to rise above what society has placed on them, the burdens that society has placed on them. He wanted everyone to become a god amongst men. He wanted every single individual to become a god in charge of their own destiny, in charge of their own fates. And that's really when we get into the whole war aspect. And he didn't really have a theory specializing on war, but we can apply his theory of the Übermensch into war. Why do we wage wars? We wage wars for several reasons. We have resources, we have land, we have power, which of course the other previous ones could be considered for power. But the one that's less talked about is that we wage wars for personal gain, for For self-satisfaction, I don't know what that is. I'm just going to get rid of that. We wage okay, we wage wars. Ignore that. We wage wars for self-satisfaction. We wage wars to fulfill some kind of, well, self-fulfilling fantasy within ourselves, and that may sound drastic, but it's true. I mean, people may fight for their countries so that they can, they feel like they are protecting their country and they feel like they're protecting others, but in a way, they're also fighting for themselves. They have something to do with their lives now. Some people join because they feel they have no other choice, and when they do that, they're fulfilling something that's missing inside of them, and that's where the Ubermensch comes in. The Ubermensch is attempting to rise above your self-pity and making you a better person by caring more about yourself. And whether or not you believe in that, it doesn't matter. That's his theory. Hello. War's value is a creation of mankind. War is only as useful, is only as valuable, is only as wanted as human beings have made it. War cannot exist without the need for it. And who's to say that need isn't created by individual societies? Value can be placed upon an object just as easily as value can be taken away. You can say that a Sharpie, such as the one I have in my hand that you can't see right now, is worth its weight in gold. And if a world leader says so, or if someone who is responsible for the money in that given society says that a Sharpie is worth its weight in gold, it is going to be worth its weight in gold. Now, if that same person tells you that it's useless, well, then it just no longer has any value. It's useless. The same can be applied to war. We as a society can collectively say that war is the most important thing, but we can also say that it is the least important thing. And that also ties back into Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch. Each individual can place value on something. So each individual can decide their own value, or how war is placed on that scale of value. Someone might see war as completely useless, and there's no reason for it, while someone else might say that war is very necessary in order to continue to live in a society. That's all about Nietzsche. Let's move on to another famous philosopher here, who would go by the name of Sun Tzu. This is someone you're probably more familiar with, or more so, The Art of War. And of course, he's famous for his book, The Art of War, which is a book that contains codes and conducts and rules and regulations and values that you should follow in wartime. Warfare to Sun Tzu was a matter of life and death, and it was a matter that should never be ignored, because war makes the world go round, or at least it did back in ancient China. War was very important to him, and we see that in his book, and how he explains that war is more than just fighting wars. War is a necessity. War is needed in order to live. He attempted to justify war, and at the same time, he understood the weight it carries. He said war was needed, but he also knew that war was dangerous, that war was capable of horrendous atrocities. I mean, you know, we look at white phosphorus, we look at the nuclear explosive used to bomb Nagasaki and Hiroshima, we look at plenty of other things. Sorry, I'm drawing blanks left and right over here, but we look at all these horrible things that happened during wars. I mean, hell, even the Holocaust. That was one of the worst events to happen in our entire lifetime, and yes, the Holocaust actually happened. I don't care who you are, the Holocaust was real. I don't know why people ever say that the Holocaust was fake, it was made up, it's fake news. Nope, it happened, and it was horrendous. Moving on. he understood that these bad things happen and that we need to try and prevent them as much as possible. But we also need to know that war is a necessity. And so he tried to create a long list of rules and a long list of ideals that should be followed in order to make sure that war does not get out of hand. Many of his teachings can be applied to how modern-day society functions today. We look at how he decided that armies should be raised and how they should structure and how they should how they should be structured and how they should be formed. And we can apply that to how he thought society should run too. You know, we should have them lined up this way, but they should be flexible and adaptable and subject to change. And the same thing goes with their leaders. They should be able to adapt to any situation. And society's leaders, the politicians, the presidents, what have you, they should all be available and flexible to be changed at a moment's notice. Oh, just kidding. Behind us, I forgot to mention, it's probably important, maybe, is the Terracotta Army, which was formed and created by Xing Shu Huang, excuse me, who was the first emperor of China. And they have withstood to this day, which is a marvel. So some good things come out of war, such as really awesome statues. Really awesome monuments. Those are multiple statues. Next we move on to St. Augustine. This is someone you most likely have never heard of, unless you are a devout religious, devout Christian, in which case you might have potentially heard about St. Augustine. But we're not going to focus on his religious theories, we're going to focus on the just war theory. The just war theory states that all wars should have a reason to be fought. They should have a reason to be started, and they should have a reason for killing people. In other words, they should be justified. There's no reason to have a war if the war is not justified, if the war does not have a purpose. So we look at the justification loophole, and that is that some people abuse this. You know, they say that a just war should be fought on equal sides, human against human. But some people try to make war to be less than human. They try to justify it as this side isn't human, so they're less than human, so why should we have to fight a just war against them? It's really quite horrific. Justification for war supports the need for it as well. We wouldn't need to have a justification for what we do if we weren't going to do it forever and ever and ever, right? And finally, we'll be looking at Michel Foucault. There he is, glorious boy right in front of us. Foucault believes that the only important knowledge gained is knowledge gained from history. He thought that we should look back on what has already happened in order to find the answers that we seek. And war should be fought for the good of the majority, not the good for the individual. If it's going to benefit society, then yeah, let's go ahead. Let's fight wars. But if we are fighting wars to protect one other person, and we're fighting wars for stupid reasons like power or for money, if you could consider those to be stupid, then we shouldn't be fighting them at all. Modern-day society has shunned war to preserve the relatively new concept of the self. So we go back to the Übermensch and the individual. You know, that's not something that people really thought of all that long ago. It's a relatively new concept, probably, 17th, 16th century at most, where people fought wars for themselves, or they committed an act of violence to protect themselves. Now, granted, this kind of thing has always existed, but, the majority of people did not consider this to be a viable reason for waging wars until recently. So next, let's move on to how society views war and violence. Starting off with morals. What exactly are morals? That's an important question to answer before we get into the relatively short list, I might say. Morals are a set of principles that help an individual determine from right and wrong. Now, the important thing to note about morals is that morals are based on individuals. Okay, it's a case-to-case basis. No two people are going to have the same morals. They might be similar, but they're not going to be exactly the same. Morals are unique, of course, to each individual, like I said, but most people in a given society generally share some similar ideas of how the world should function. The mass killings accompanied by war is shunned by society's collective morals. So all those people that have generally similar ways of thinking all generally accept the fact that mass killings are bad. You know, here in America we've had mass killings every week except for when coronavirus started, and now it's started to calm down a little, but it has gone on for so long, and we are disgusted, most of us, by the fact that these mass killings are happening. And when you think about it, they happen in war very often. You know, very infrequently does a war happen where, less than 10 people die. I don't even think that's ever happened. The criminalization of aggressive warfare. So there's a difference between non-aggressive and aggressive warfare. And non-aggressive warfare is just regular war. Aggressive warfare is when you go to extreme lengths to hurt, to torture, to kill more than the required, air quotes, amount of people. And it's when you start committing war crimes and when things start becoming awful and they go against our morals. And we've been trying to criminalize this, and the criminalization of aggressive warfare shows that we care enough about it, because it's a necessity, to make crimes about how war should be waged. We're making laws of how war should be waged. And next are customs, which are quite different from morals, actually. Customs are the collective thoughts, values, and traditions passed on throughout the generations. So these are going to be things that your grandparents are passing down to you to make sure that our culture continues to exist the way it did before. The ability and need to wage war should be considered a custom because people in our past generations, understand that war was fought for money and for power and all that good stuff, and they think that we need to continue this trend, that this necessity needs to continue to be a necessity, and that is why we're passing it down as a custom. Older generations want to preserve war because it allows society to maintain power, resources, and alliances. Morals and customs often come into conflict with one another, so we find ourselves at odds between what we think is right and wrong and what society thinks is right and wrong. And Nietzsche and Foucault attempted to break free of their culture's customs, and of course they were either shunned or respected for it, depending on when you talk about it, who you ask, and when you ask them. And finally we come to the fascination with death. This is a gladiatorial arena. It is a picture of the actual amphitheater in Rome that they used to fight. If you don't know what gladiators are, I can convince you to look it up. We have this handy thing called Google, and it is very useful in many situations, especially this one. But every year, Rome still has this festival where they dress up in their big gladiatorial costumes and they fight each other like they did back in the old days, except nowadays they don't actually kill each other. I think I've never been to Rome, I've never seen this happen during their festival, but I would imagine they don't kill each other. Let's talk about Sigmund Freud. So Sigmund Freud theorized that all life exists to die. Everyone that lives, everyone that exists, that is human, has an unconscious need to return to death. Whoa. Okay, Sigmund Freud has some very weird theories. So, the Oedipus and the Electric complex. This one, I'm not going to say it takes the cake because they all equally take the cake. This one is pretty strange. He referred to it as the death drive, or Thanatos being the god of death. The fear of death actually drives the human intrigue forward, which is where Freud's other theory of the repetition compulsion comes in. It's where people attempt to do something over and over and over again, something that is dangerous, that might kill them, because they think that if they embrace something that might kill them, it will prevent them from being killed, or it will save them from being afraid to be killed. And we can apply this to war. People commit wars because they are afraid of what happens if they are on, if they are the ones. I'm going to start over, okay? People wage wars because they are afraid of what would happen if they were attacked themselves. They wage wars on others and they attempt to be the winning side so that they do not end up the losing side because they don't want to die. The Sigmund Freud actually kind of makes sense in this context, which I never thought I would hear myself say. So that's the gist of my presentation. Just to sum up, war and violence has always been condemned to secret. Well, not always. It has recently been condemned to secrecy. It has always been a necessity, but for some reason we now have shunned it as this horrible, bad thing. I know, of course, it might be because of the mass killings and whatnot, but really, I just think it's because society has continued to evolve and to change. I wasn't going into this presentation thinking that, or into this research thinking that, but now that I've come out of it on the other side of the tracks, I think it's because society has evolved, as loose of a term that may be. The inherently evil and sinful practice that is warfare is a relatively recent body of thought, Like I said before, war hasn't always been inherently evil, it's been an inherent necessity. The great philosophy of Nietzsche, Sun Tzu, St. Augustine, and Michel Foucault can all be applied and utilized to explain the need for war. That's really what most of my presentation was about. War is a necessity, and therefore, in a way, it's also inevitable. War, violence, death, it's necessary, and I don't think too many of us realize that it's necessary, and that we cannot avoid it. That war has always existed, is currently in existence, and will continue to exist. And therefore, so will death and violence and all kinds of bloodshed. It will continue to follow us wherever we go, and we cannot escape it, no matter how hard we try. That was just a little taste of nihilism for you there. But anyway, that wraps up my presentation, so I hope you enjoyed, possibly learned something new, or at the very least, stuck through to the end. I'm sorry that it's 27 minutes long. I tried to cut it down, but it just didn't work. I was just so interested in this, so whether or not you watch it, I hope you enjoyed my presentation, and thanks a lot.